Hey guys, welcome back. We got a little bit different setup here, so we're going to try this out and see how it works. But today we are picking back up with our third lecture on the Industrial Revolution for my Advanced American History class. Just a reminder, as we go through this lecture, please jot down any questions you may have, and please either shoot those in an email to me or post them on Schoology, and I can get back to you right away. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Today we got an interesting lecture. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the wealthiest Americans to ever have lived, and we'll look at some of their wealth. But I want to go back and kind of lay the groundwork again as to exactly how they make their money and kind of overall the changes that are happening in this country. So again, the Industrial Revolution, just simply defined, is this transition from muscle power to machine power. All right, so you take the picture on the left, right? For literally millennia, this is how we farmed, with horses, with, work animals that helped us plow the fields. But that is difficult work. Not only is it difficult for the humans and the animals, but you also have all the care that is needed. Horses require food and sleep and all that thing. But machines, they do not. I mean, as long as you keep plugging them with oil and gas, they can keep chugging along. So, this is going to increase production really at all levels and throughout all industries. Not only farming. I mean, you think about how many more fields you can plow, using a John Deere tractor versus a horse. But also, manufacturing. They're going to be, making goods at higher rates than ever before, which also makes them cheaper. And so people are going to be able to afford goods unlike ever before. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with some negative issues as well, and we of course will cover those. But there's a lot of positives from this, at least in the short term. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me remind you that America it was very blessed with a lot of unique geographic benefits. And so natural resources is something that for centuries, I mean, we have been able to enjoy, extract from the ground to not only use here in our country, but to also sell to markets elsewhere. So, especially as the West got settled, remember all those people rushed out west when they found gold, right? In 1849 out in California. But not just gold, things like copper, a lot of silver mines out in places like Nevada, timber, of course, the Northwest with its lush forests. So there's a lot of natural resources. But the one I want to focus on today is oil, black gold, Texas tea, oil. So when they, we had known about oil, and we had known about a lot of its properties really for thousands of years. Even Native Americans had used oil for certain medicinal properties. But things start to change during the Industrial Revolution. In 1859, a man named Edwin Drake digs even deeper than anybody had before by using a steam engine to drill for oil. So, before we had only been limited to kind of what oil was coming up to the surface or just right below the surface. But the steam engine allows us to drill down to levels we had never dreamt before, and we were able to get oil in mass production. And that really changes things. Now, interestingly enough, today we understand how valuable oil is. At the time, oil was primarily being refined into kerosene. Okay. Now, kerosene we don't use as often today, very flammable and all that. But for the most part, people were using kerosene for lanterns, and they were lighting, not only public streets, but their houses with kerosene lamps. So that was the primary use of oil. So, early on it gained this, it kind of gained steam, where people were using, our natural resource of oil to light kerosene. Gasoline was actually a byproduct of this refining process, and for years they actually threw it away. They thought it was too unstable, that gasoline really didn't have a purpose. But then everything changes with the invention of the internal combustible engine, and especially its use in the automobile. So oil is going to be kind of the main focus, and by far that is the most important natural resource to this industrial period, is the use and the refinement of oil. Now, another major resource was iron. Okay, and iron comes out of the ground naturally. But we've known this for thousands of years. Back in the so-called Iron Age, about 2,000 years ago, they have been using iron to make tools and weapons for literally millennia. But iron had some properties that make it difficult to use. First of all, if you leave it out, I mean, we've all seen rusty nails that have been left out in the rain, rusty tools. So they tend to rust very easily when exposed to water and air. That's a major problem, especially if you're laying down railroad tracks out in the middle of Nebraska, where it's going to rain a lot. You got to make sure they don't rust over. But also, iron can be brittle and it can break. Now, what they discovered discovered with an asterisk, kind of, it's all relative, right? Because steel has been made for, again, thousands of years, but pure steel, like what we're going to see here, it was a completely different beast. What they realized was there were different ways you could take iron out of the ground and remove all the impurities to make it this pure item known as steel. Okay, there were two main processes that were used during this industrial period. First of all, the Bessemer process. The picture down in the bottom left, you can see this big egg-like container. They would basically heat this up, and they would put the iron in here and heat it up to where it truly liquefied. And so it would get so hot that all those little impurities, like extra carbon and whatnot, would kind of be melted off, kind of evaporate. And what you were left with was pure iron, which is made into steel, very, very strong. And that was really kind of the first way to cheaply mass produce what was happening. The open hearth process. This was a kind of a newer invention, a newer process where they actually were able to use other scrap metals and raw materials in order to make the steel just as strong. So, they're refining these processes, and this is going to revolutionize the world, not just America, but the world, because now all of a sudden, with things like steel. Before, you were very limited on how far up you could build. So it caused, cities to build outward. Well, now with steel, you can stack layer on top of buildings, and next thing you know, cities start growing up. All right, this is going to be the beginning of the skyscrapers. This is where we're going to see, some of the newer bridges that could extend farther than ever thought before, because they're using the strong metal known as steel. So here's some inventions that were using steel early on. Of course, buildings. I mentioned, bridges. The Brooklyn Bridge is formed making steel. Again, it would have been impossible before that, given the lighter metal. Railroads. Again, steel does not rust as easily as just as iron. So you were able to lay tracks out in the middle of exposure and not have to deal with any issues of rust. Barbed wire. So we talked a little bit about that a few lectures ago. Helped enclose the plains in a very cheap way to enclose off, one's land. So you start to see the West start partitioning and dividing up. And farm machinery is going to use steel. So, a steel plow is going to be much more efficient, stronger than a plow made of any other metal. So again, these kind of inventions and improvements are helping in all kinds of areas, not just a single area, but industry is changing. Another big change is the harnessing of electricity, not the discovery. We've known about electricity for a long time. Even the ancient Egyptians did experiments with electricity. But what we start to utilize here is the harnessing of electricity. Again, with lightning, my favorite movie of all time is Back to the Future. And in that movie, if you haven't seen it, they're trying to basically time out when a lightning strike will happen so they can harness that electricity. In 1890, Thomas Edison figured out a way to basically do that, to create contraptions that would allow for electricity to be used in machines. And one of the first inventions he developed with this was the light bulb. I mentioned a few slides ago about kerosene lamps being the main go-to for lighting houses and streets. This is all going to change with the invention of the light bulb, and he will develop that in his Menlo Park laboratory in 1876. And very famously, you can see the bulb he's holding there, kind of a funky design. Very famously, Thomas Edison designed hundreds of different designs for the light bulb until finally arriving at the one that for the most part is still used to this day. But when we realize how to harness electricity, I want you to think about how revolutionary that truly is. Oh, you think about everything right now that you are using that is, using electricity. Not only your phone, your computer, the lights in the ceiling. I mean, it is all around us, and it is, without that in our lives, I mean, it would be completely different. So, that's truly revolutionary. And perhaps I have not talked enough about what that word means, but a revolution. I mean, this is a completely new way of life for people. So I hope we kind of appreciate how the Industrial Revolution is literally altering the fundamentals of life and how we live, how we spend our free time. And again, like I mentioned in the last lecture, just our view of time itself. It is all changing due to the inventions that are being produced at this time. You can see there the uses of electricity. You have electricity powering factories. Before, mills would have to be placed along waterways in order to, push the machinery inside. But now you could have a factory in the middle of a wheat field in Kansas, as long as it was powered by electricity. So there's no need for water or wind power with electricity. You can place these anywhere. But you can see some of the other uses: electric streetcars. We're going to see those start popping up. Home appliances, making our lives easier there. Sewing machines, that's going to be a big deal when we start talking about some of these factories that are mass producing goods. They're using electrical machines eventually to mass produce it. So again, revolutionary in how it changes our lives and how we produce goods. Communications, telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, and not to get too much in the detail, there is some debate on exactly, if it was Bell that was the one to invent it. There was other inventors that were working on it around the same time, but he's the one that often gets credit. Very early on, it was very slow. It was very expensive. But without those inventions, we that is definitely the groundwork for what we have today. I'll never forget a few years back, I went to China, and I'm standing in the middle of Tiananmen Square talking on my cell phone to my grandma, who's literally like, with the time zones, a day in the past, just thinking how surreal that was. And I've grown up around this, but, for her, to have her grandson on the other side of the world talking to her live, it was just a pretty interesting moment. I always kind of reflect on that when we get to this slide. Transportation. We talked about these two issues in our last lecture, but steamships, that was kind of the first wave of the transformation revolution, which allowed access to riverways and, again, cheaper passage, not only across oceans, but upriver, makes it easier and cheaper for people to travel than ever before. Railroads, as we talked about last time, not only allows us to connect people, but also markets. That is the big push with our economic system. You have to be able to get goods to markets, to people. If you can produce all the goods you want, that's fine. But if you can't get it to people, it does you no good. So railroads, transportation, it's all changing quite rapidly. All right, let's go through a couple of these terms. as we're going to start shifting into what I call big business, okay? First one, Monopoly. When I say Monopoly, of course you think of the board game. We've all played this family board game that, of course, ends with someone getting upset, flipping the board game, and promising to never play again. In this situation, it's somewhat the same. You know, the goal of the game is to control all the properties, right? If you control all the properties, you're going to win. Well, that's the same thing here. Monopoly is complete control over an industry's production, quality, wages, and prices charged. Let's break that down just a little bit. Complete control. Okay, so we talked about with the railroad lecture, we talked about how by the early 1900s, there were about 7 companies that controlled almost all the railroad lines in America. That is borderline monopolies, to where you have just relatively few people controlling an entire industry. Right? Not just one company. We're talking about an entire industry, the railroad lines or steel, or even web browsers, right? Monopolies in the late 90s. Bill Gates found himself in hot water because the government kind of came after Microsoft for having a monopoly, in which they were forcing people, when they got their machines, they had to use their own web browsers, which had certain settings and destinations that they were able to gain a lot of influence overall in the early internet. And there was a concern, I think strangely, we aren't talking about it as much, but I think it's a much bigger problem today when you're talking about companies like Google and Facebook. I mean, they are controlling what we see, and that's not conspiracy. I mean, that is fact. Those are advertising machines that have complex algorithms that are producing results that they are getting you to they're controlling clicks and all that. So I think we're going to see some talk about monopolies later on with Google, with Facebook, especially as the options for what we use, Amazon, I think, especially with kind of the economic bubble bursting, that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic. We're seeing Amazon, grow tremendously in size, while we're seeing our small mom and pop stores, downtown, they're closing up because people aren't using those as much. So this is still a major topic that we need to understand, and we need to make sure that we can identify what a monopoly is. Again, because it's not just that they've won the game. It's not just that they're the best business. What ends up happening whenever monopolies emerge is that often they will use often negative tactics to basically put others out of business. And when you have fewer options, we get into dangerous levels. Again, what happens if we're going to talk about John D. Rockefeller here soon, who controlled basically all the oil in the country. What happens if he decides to double the price of oil overnight? Well, he owns it all. He could do that. So there's a lot of dangers that in some ways kind of holding the American public hostage. So monopolies existed back then. We'll talk about efforts they took to break those up, and they exist today, perhaps in some ways even more so than back then. A trust. This one is very similar to a monopoly, but a group of people who run separate companies as one large corporation. So think about it, kind of like, in some ways, kind of like Google, right? So Google, a couple of years ago, formed a parent company called Alphabet. And Alphabet is kind of the head of the Google, kind of hydra. So Alphabet not only has, the search engine, the advertisement, they have, all these different websites that they bought up, YouTube, and, all these different sites that they kind of operate under one. Well, that same thing was going on back in the early industrial period as well. So what ends up happening is that you have people sitting on these boards that they're controlling entire industry through one company. They're controlling multiple companies through kind of one really figurehead company at the top. A robber baron. This is a term I am going to use quite a bit from here on out, so get to know it. But someone who uses anti-competitive or questionable business practices to amass a large amount of power and wealth. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, but what we see here is that some of these guys we're about to talk about, they gain that wealth through not only deceit, but in some cases downright violence. So we're going to be reading about that a little bit this week. But some of these guys did not just earn it through hard work. Some of them earned it through sabotage. Putting their other competitors out of business by even, like I said, sabotaging their factories and things like that. So we have to make sure that the game is at least fair. It doesn't have to be equal, but the game does need to be fair. A couple other terms you need to know: holding company, corporation whose sole purpose is to buy the stock of other companies. J.P. Morgan was big on this. So, basically kind of investing firms almost that would go out and buy up most of the stock of a company. Well, now you're the owner of that company if you own most of the stock. So a holding company, they don't actually produce anything themselves. They just simply hold on to the stock of other companies. Number 5, this one doesn't relate as much, but social Darwinism. This is something that's happening globally at this time that we have to understand in order to kind of process why there is such growing inequality happening in our society. Now, part of this comes out of Charles Darwin's fairly recent theories that he had written about evolution, seeing how, nature kind of evolves, the survival of the fittest. You might have heard that term before. Well, who are the fittest, right? Well, in the animal world, if a lion takes off after a group of gazelle, the strongest gazelle, the fastest gazelle, they get away, right? The one in the back, the weaker one, the one that's just not as big, not as strong, they're the ones that get gobbled up. Well, people began applying that kind of logic to society. And they said, listen, it just makes sense that, businesses, a big business like Amazon, well, it just makes sense that, they're going to gobble up all these mom and pop stores. And that may be logical. That does kind of make sense. But eventually, what happens is they become big and strong to where none of the other companies are even, it's possible to exist. So, people begin applying this idea of natural selection to society and saying that it just makes sense that the stronger individuals will get stronger, the stronger companies will get stronger, and that the weaker ones will fall away. That second line there, used to justify laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a term I'm going to come back to multiple times, but I always tell this joke in class. I wish we were in class so I could pick on somebody, but I'll never forget my favorite high school teacher, my history teacher, when we talked about laissez-faire. He said, it's what Turner's girlfriend says to him. It means hands off. And you'll get that joke if you here in a second. But so laissez-faire, hands off. It means the government is keeping their hands off a business. They're allowing them to do whatever they want. Okay, and this gets into the issue of what's called regulation. All right, so today we have certain regulations in place that are designed to try and limit either greed or corruption or think about environmental regulations. We often hear the environment being tied into this. Instead of allowing companies, a factory to dump waste directly into a river, there are regulations, laws that say you're not allowed to dump that waste into a river. You need to, find another way to get rid of it. So there's certain rules and regulations that exist to try and protect the greater good in society. Now, not saying that all regulations are good. Sometimes, many industries can be over-regulated. And, this is often a source of contention between Republicans and Democrats on how much regulation is too much. I would think most of us would probably agree that some regulation is needed. I mean, ultimately, we do need to have some regulations to make sure that greed isn't destroying, certain industries and things like that. But laissez-faire, the government is keeping their hands off of business. They're allowing businesses to kind of operate however they want. Usually in the fall semester, we read a book called The Jungle, and it is an older book by a man named Upton Sinclair, who was a journalist in Chicago in the early 1900s, and he toured a bunch of meat packing facilities. And one thing he started noticing was, and talking with the people that work there, was not only, what's the goal of these factories to just produce as much meat as possible, but they were also, they really weren't taking many safety precautions, both for their workers, but also for the food itself and therefore the consumer. So in this book, there's examples of, rats falling into the mixture. There's examples of even, arms getting sawed off and incorporated into the sausage and whatnot, and they just keep going. Well, there's no regulation in place. It's completely laissez-faire. There's nothing to stop them from, doing what they want for the maximum amount of profit. But ultimately, society pays the price tag there, right? Appeal to Protestant work ethic, individual responsibility, but also blame. And I put that picture down at the bottom because this does get applied to race as well worldwide. This idea of social Darwinism, being applied to race. This is a very racist age, and there's no way around that. But this is an age in which, some nations saw themselves and their race as, being stronger than others. And there was a lot of pseudoscience that gets drawn into this as well, that believing that certain races are intellectually superior to those, to others. This is kind of that rabbit hole you go down when you start applying this idea of natural selection to society. And it's just a natural progression to think, let's apply this to nations. Right? So going back to that original analogy of, the lion and the gazelle, well, it just makes sense then that a strong nation like Britain or, it would go into a weaker nation like India and be able to take it over. It makes sense, right? I mean, that's natural selection. Or Germany, they should be able to, go into other nations around them and kind of gobble up. This will lead to empire, right? So empires have started to grow, but during this period, we are going to see the great empires of the 20th century being born here. All of Africa will get carved up during this time. And again, this is what they use to justify that, right? Africa's weak, they're backwards. The technology is lacking. They don't have, the same military power as we do. Therefore, we're justified in going in. And there were other reasons that they did that. But, this is setting us up for a lot of, frankly, it's setting us up for World War I. We're heading towards the Great War very quickly, and within the next few decades, we're going to see the most devastating war in human history ever take place. And the Industrial Revolution and its ideas of social Darwinism are a big part of that. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into some of these so-called captains of industry, or if you prefer the negative term, robber barons. All right, so for each guy, I'm going to tell you, first of all, what industry they are known for. For your exam, it's very important you know what industry is tied to each of these men. Andrew Carnegie is the first one. No particular order here. But Carnegie was an immigrant. He came to America from Scotland. He began working in a mill about mid-century there. He was a very intelligent, very bright young man. In fact, at one point, you can see the little factoid there. This one always cracks me up. He even convinced his family at a very young age to take out another mortgage or a loan on their house so he could invest in stock. Now, I don't know how many of you guys that would fly over if you went to your parents and said, hey, Mom, I got this great stock tip. I need you to take out a loan on the house so I can invest. Well, Carnegie's parents maybe trusted him with investments a little bit more. He was a genius, but no offense to you. But he was able to, constantly be on the forefront of this. He went back home to visit for a little bit, and while he was back in Great Britain, he actually witnessed that Bessemer process we were talking about. And the Industrial Revolution started in some of these countries like Belgium and Germany and Britain, and it was kind of a slow process getting them started. But this new technology, I mean, this in some cases was kind of like a national secret, right? They did not want other countries to develop this because you have an edge as long as you have the new technology. Well, Carnegie was able to see this Bessemer process, and he realized, man, if we could use the resources of America and the population of America to fuel this industry, we could use this process to create our own steel and eventually take over the entire industry. And that's exactly what he did. Within 20 years, his one company back home was making more steel than all of Great Britain combined. So, he used this technology, improved upon it over the years. And I want to talk about why he was successful. First of all, he did constantly incorporate new techniques. I'll never forget a story I heard about Carnegie where he built this brand new machine that helped make steel even purer. That was great. And the day it was unveiled, he was standing there, with his arms crossed, just telling his head engineer, look at it, isn't it beautiful? This brand new machine, we're going to be able to make so much more steel. And his head engineer said, it is amazing. It's the best in the world. He said, but if we had known what we know now, we would have built it a little bit differently. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we could have saved 1/8 of a cent on every ton of steel. Well, for many people, looking at this brand new machine that they had built that cost over $1 million, which today, I mean, is tens of millions of dollars. Carnegie did some calculations very quickly in his head, and even though it was 1/8 of a penny on every ton of steel, he realized that over the long term, that keeping up with the new technique, new technology, that was actually going to pay dividends. And so he actually told his head engineer, he said, tear it down. We're going to build it right. So that's one reason Carnegie was always on top of this industry, is because he was constantly tweaking what they had previously done to make sure, hiring scientists to come in and make sure that the metal was pure and it was good. Talented people to work in his company. He himself might not have had the scientific background in order to do that, but he was a manager and organizer of these people. This is the real big reason that Carnegie was so successful. And by the way, time out. I should mention, I keep saying Carnegie. All right, that's actually the appropriate way to say it. Either one is technically, correct. But at the time, he would have pronounced it Carnegie. But I know Carnegie Hall, named after him. I know that's turned into kind of the modern, kind of the popular pronunciation. Either one's fine, but Carnegie is how contemporaries would have called him. So we got two different types of what's called integration. And this is really, I want you to focus on this. This is where Carnegie was different from every other person in his industry. First of all, vertical, okay, up and down, vertical integration. So look at the bottom left image there. This is where you buy out all your suppliers. So Carnegie said, listen, we're we got these, we want to make steel, right? So what are all the things we need to make steel? Well, you got to have iron mines. You got to have, after you dig it out of the ground, you got to, ship it to your factory. So you use, railroads. So he's saying, we're paying all these other companies to do something we need done. Right? Why don't we just buy up all those other companies? So, not only was he invested in steel, but he started buying up all the companies necessary to produce his product. That is called vertical integration, and that's a very important part of business here. I'm also reminded again about Amazon. You'll notice Amazon over the last few years has started, creating their own delivery service, right? I mean, when you get a package, usually it's an Amazon truck that pulls up in front of your house. It's not necessarily the post office anymore, right? That is vertical integration. They have figured out, instead of paying the post office to do something, we can do it cheaper ourselves. And so now all of a sudden they're in the delivery industry, and that's going to change even more in the future with drones. So watch out overhead. The next item, horizontal integration. Another thing Carnegie did was he bought out his competitors and sometimes paid even double what they were actually worth just to get them to stop competing with him, right? If you buy up all the competition, one thing in capitalism is competition drives down price, right? That's good for us, the consumer, right? When companies compete for our business, right, we get the best product at the lowest price. But what happens if there's no competition? Well, that's what Carnegie realized. If you buy up all the competition, there's no one else to drive your price lower, well, then you can drive your price higher on your own. This is one of the problems of a monopoly. So when there's less competition, we will pay more for goods, and usually we'll even have less options available to us. So competition is a good thing, and we should push for competition. By 1901, Carnegie Steel owned 80% of the nation's steel. And this is at a time, guys, where cities are booming, right? It'd be one thing to own a steel company now, but this is at a time where every major city is building bridges and skyscrapers. This is when steel is going to be most used to lay the foundation of our modern cities than ever before. Philanthropic deeds. So, these guys, and we have an assignment this week I'm going to ask you to complete where you need to look at, did this person have more of a positive or a negative impact on America? They all did some good things. They all did some bad things. So philanthropic deeds. One thing that Carnegie did, setting kind of what I think is a great precedent here. He did agree to give away 90% of his wealth over the course of his lifetime. And, a lot of the billionaires today have decided to follow this example as well. And they're giving away their wealth. Bill Gates, I know, is one of Warren Buffett. They're giving away most of their wealth during their lifetime as well. But he gave away 90% of his wealth to libraries and schools and universities. Definitely a good thing there. I've actually I got a picture there from a Carnegie library. But you'll notice, especially around, libraries that were built around this time period, a lot of times there'll be a plaque outside that says, this library was built with donations from the Carnegie Institute or whatnot. So, definitely some good things. So we have to keep it all in balance, understand that there was some good, some bad. It's tough to draw, a straight line and say, this was a bad man or this was a good man. I mean, there's always a little bit of both. John D. Rockefeller. Perhaps I should have started with Rockefeller because up until fairly recently, Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in the entire world, the wealthiest American by far. Jeff Bezos has recently taken over that distinction, and it kind of depends on how you look, the overall amount of wealth or the percentage of nation's GDP, but Rockefeller and Bezos are right up there together. To put it in perspective, at the height of Rockefeller's wealth, he would be worth about 4 times what Bill Gates is worth. Okay, so that should put it in perspective. But Rockefeller was known for oil. Now, he actually worked for a company. It was an oil company that was making, or actually, I may not have been an oil company. I can't remember what type of company it was, but they actually sent him out to investigate, whether there was any future in oil. And he reported back to that company. He said, no, there's no future in it. Don't invest here. But then immediately turned in his 2 weeks notice and started his own oil company. He recognized the fact that this was going to be the future. Again, first with kerosene, lighting people's homes, very important. But then eventually, with oil turning into gasoline. So you can see there, over 10 years, he would grow that industry to where he controlled, grow his company to where he controlled 90% of the overall oil resources in America, and that would peak at 97%. I want you to think about, when you drive around town, just gas stations you see, right? And that's a small percentage of what oil is used for. Just think about all the gas stations, just one person owning all of that, and then multiply that by every city in America. If every single person is buying their gas, from Rockefeller, imagine how much money is being made. And again, that doesn't even include oil that's being used in machines and to fuel tankers and all that stuff. So now we mentioned trusts before. the Standard Oil was a trust that Rockefeller used to control a lot of other companies. And so, you can see there in that political cartoon, he's standing on top of Standard Oil there with his crown. You'll notice all the different companies that are a part of that crown, though, right? You got the railroads, you got the oil companies at the top. Again, using the vertical integration there, he was able to get his hands all across these different industries, and he controlled it all. I mean, he controlled all the nation's oil. In 1911, Standard Oil would be broken. I can't remember. Yeah, there we go. In 1911, Standard Oil would be broken up, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was a monopoly, that it had violated some laws written a few decades before, and that they had too much power. Basically, they had kind of won the capitalism game, and they had too much power. And so they ordered that Standard Oil be broken up into various companies. So that's exactly what happened. And today they are still some of the biggest oil companies in the world operating today. Just look at these names: Chevron, Exxon, Mobil. I mean, these are the biggest oil companies in the world, even still today. Imagine them all being controlled by one man. Philanthropic deeds. Rockefeller didn't give us as much of his wealth away. In fact, his descendants still continue to be extremely wealthy. If you've ever been to New York, I assume you've been to Rockefeller Plaza. You've seen maybe the big Christmas tree and the ice skating rink there. But Rockefeller, he would give away some money, created the University of Chicago, which is one of the top history universities in the world, created a hospital medical institute that actually helped cure yellow fever. That's something that had plagued mankind forever. So, there's definitely some good that gets mixed in. Rockefeller in particular, though, there were definitely some shady things that he was a part of. And when I talk about sabotaging other companies and other competitors, he's one that I'm talking about. Again, kind of breaking down into some of those modern day companies that you probably recognize. That is, those all used to be a part of Standard Oil. The next one, J.P. Morgan. He's going to be known for two industries. First of all, holding companies. That's how he mainly organizes his empire. But eventually, he's going to buy up Carnegie Steel. In 1901, he buys out Andrew Carnegie and turns Carnegie Steel into U.S. Steel, the world's largest business, and still one of the largest businesses today. But J.P. Morgan, extremely wealthy, but again, the holding companies, buying up other companies, and not even producing anything themselves, just kind of buying up the stock of other companies. A couple other guys, and I shouldn't just push them off to the side. These are all billionaires by today's standards. Leland Stanford, you might be familiar with Stanford University, the namesake here. Stanford was one of those that was behind the Transcontinental Railroad and made a lot of money off of that. Another railroad mogul, got his start in steamships, was Cornelius Vanderbilt. So again, gave money to start Vanderbilt University. Extremely wealthy. And Vanderbilt was, I think, the second wealthiest American for a very long time. Again, Bezos has kind of risen up there above these guys, but Vanderbilt for a long time was the wealthiest. Rockefeller eventually replaced him, and so up there at the very top. Now, one thing I'm going to ask you guys to do this week is to decide, whether these guys were more of a positive or negative impact on our society. So the things you need to keep in mind here, first of all, they all did a little good. They all did a little bad, right? It's hard to reach this, but it's one reason that I enjoy asking the question. So what I'm going to ask you is, do you consider, through some of the things that you've heard from me, but also what you're going to read for me this week, do you consider these people to be more captains of industry? All right, so, these are positive things, right? So revolutionize, develop business to fullest potential. We talked about how Carnegie constantly was using metallurgists and scientists to make the strongest steel possible. That's a good thing, right? Gave generously to social causes. So, just mentioned Rockefeller, literally ending a disease, yellow fever, that had plagued mankind forever. So there's definitely positives there. Developed new technology, later used nationwide. So you could say, ultimately these strong industries made America stronger, that it put us on the map. We start selling goods across the world globally because of this industry. That's all good. That's all a positive thing. but there's some negative things associated as well. So, perhaps you see them more as robber barons, again, negative terms. So definitely using anti-competitive business practices, buying up competitors to eliminate competition, to drive up their prices. Same time, exploiting workers. That's something we really haven't focused on. And next unit, we're going to focus kind of an overlap in time periods we're studying, but we're going to look a little bit more at workers and what they're going through at this time. And I'll just tell you right now, it's not good. Again, there's no laws, regulations protecting workers. There's nothing such as minimum wage or even safety conditions that have to be met. Workers are getting exploited constantly, and they're literally making pennies a day. They're hiring child workers, as young as 6 or 7. And there's no protections for those people. As I said, final one there, squash competition, not allowing other businesses to explore similar areas. So, you could say that, yes, they, these industries were relatively, they're creating new techniques, but you could also say, hey, there were other companies that could have been developing maybe even better techniques, but they got gobbled up by these big companies. So, when you have less competition, you're going to have less innovation. So, that definitely is kind of a negative there. All right, guys, that will do it for me. I'm going to wrap this one up. I'm sorry it was a little bit longer than usual. Hopefully you've broken this lecture up a little bit. That is it about the robber barons. Again, make sure to check Schoology for this week's assignment regarding those robber barons. I'm interested to hear whether you think some of these guys were more positive or a negative impact on our society. As always, please email me with any questions you guys have, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks.